All right, everybody, it's time for this week's market snapshot, RealTalk market snapshot about what's happened in the Northern Virginia real estate market in the last 7 days. This is going to be an interesting one because we're seeing how the Memorial Day weekend affected the Northern Virginia real estate market. So let's dive in. Okay, so this market snapshot is a little bit different because we had the Memorial Day weekend, which began obviously on Friday, and it lasted all the way through until Wednesday because of the kids traveling. So we're going to see what this kind of event has, what kind of effect this event has on the real estate market. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to review 2 weeks today because we had half of the report is the week that started Memorial Day, the week break, and the other half of the report is the week that finished it. So we're going to go over 2 weeks on this. So let's go ahead and dive into it and see what happened. All right, so as always, our black line is going to be our buyer activity. These are the number of properties that went under contract in the last 7 days. And you can see that the week beginning Memorial Day, there was a huge drop in listings. A huge drop in buyer activity. It's because buyers were getting ready to travel. They weren't really focused on real estate. And then we had a little bit of an uptick. Where's my mouse? A little bit of an uptick on the second half of this, the second part of that week. Whereas inventory took an opposite effect. Inventory had a little bit of a spike, so it stayed pretty even. But then as we actually went into the weekend, you can see there was a huge drop. Not many people put their properties on the market on Memorial Day weekend, which is a good strategy because your buyers have left the area. So a huge drop, and then a huge drop in inventory, a slight uptick in buyer activity. This week right here is always a really good week for buyers to purchase properties because you have a little bit of a better chance of being in a less competitive situation, but you're going to see that it was still very competitive as we go through the contract trends. So what did this do to the buyer's market versus seller's market? We go down here to our weekly graph here, and as always, our gray line here is a neutral market. Anything above that gray line belongs to sellers. They have the leverage. Anything below it belongs to buyers. So you can see this first week when buyer activity dropped and inventory spiked up, the first part of that, these two became pretty even. So we dropped into a neutral market. And then the second week when that buyer activity went up and there was no new inventory, then we had an increase into that seller's market. So what did this do? So the contract trends were looking specifically at this last 7 days. In other words, when buyer activity went up and inventory went down, what happened? So we're going to focus on Northern Virginia here. Thank you to my very nondescript mouse-drawn circles. This is information from Cardinal Title. You'll see there are only 188 contracts that came in on that month, or on that week. Again, this was the week that it contained the majority of the Memorial Day weekend and while the kids were out of school, so the buyers just were not here. So you'll see that 188 contracts came in. Northern Virginia, 46% of them went above asking price, 26% went at asking price, and 28% below. So 72% went at or above asking price. If you look over here, you'll see 79% went in under 21 days, with 36% going within the first 7 days. Now, what's interesting about this is 36% went in the first. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong area. Going over here to Northern Virginia. I apologize, skip that. But still 73%. We had 72% here. 73% of the properties went on or before that 21-day mark. Now, you'll notice that 53% of the properties went under 7 days, but only 46% went above asking price. So again, buyers, when you're with your agent, just because it's that first week, don't necessarily panic and throw extra money at a property. There's still a chance you might get it for asking price. You're certainly not going to get a discount, but you might get it at asking price. So make sure your realtor is doing the research, talking to the listing agent, and see what the situation is. Contingencies. Now, this is where we're starting to see the competition pick up. For the first time in a long time, we're below 60% of people having their finance contingencies and 54% on people having appraisal contingencies. So this tells us that there was more competition and that buyers are starting to waive these contingencies. And if you go down here to home inspection contingency, it was 50-50. So 50% of the buyers did not have a home inspection in their contract. Again, this is lower than it has been over the last couple months. We've been at least in the 60% range with those home inspection contingencies. Does not mean the buyer did not get the home inspection. They could have done a pre-inspection, a pre-offer inspection but they were not part of the contract. So for sellers, you're starting to see a trend where the contingencies are starting to back off a little bit, but you've got to be priced right, because that you want to sell in that first 7 to 21 days so you can actually get contracts that will have these features. You can see financing versus cash. Northern Virginia, only 16% were cash. I say this every week. If you're a cash buyer, the only advantages that really gives you in a situation where it's a seller's market like this is that you're able to close quicker, which is great because that gives the seller their money a lot quicker, and you do not have to have an appraisal. There are many buyers with financing that are able to waive those appraisals, and they do what's called a pre-offer full approval, so they can actually compete with that as well. So if you're a cash buyer, you need to have your head wrapped around the fact that you're probably going to have to pay at least asking price, at least at this time of the market. Seller subsidy, about 21% of the contracts had some kind of seller subsidy. That was sellers contributing to closing costs or some kind of cash back, some kind of seller concession. And then as far as buyer agent compensation, 98% of the contracts had buyer agent compensation as part of the sales contract, meaning that the seller did contribute to the buyer agent compensation. And 88% of those, 77% and 11%, were at 2.5% or higher. So what this means for sellers is that as a seller, the buyer agent compensation is no longer predetermined. Everybody's aware of this, but 88% of the sellers out there are offering 2.5% or higher. So you just need to keep that in mind. The buyer agent compensation is a negotiable point. It's a negotiable point of the actual contract. So if you as a seller want to be competitive, you may end up having to pay, having to contribute a significant amount of that buyer agent compensation. Okay, I hope this is helpful for everybody. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And the number is 703-783-2143, and we will see you on next week's Market Report. Have a great week.